I always dreaded the monthly Ashcraft-Oft family dinners. They were more like a competition, an opportunity for my relatives to show off their wealth and accomplishments. Each gathering seemed to revolve around one thing: who could boast the most, who could outdo the other with the latest property, the grandest vacation, or the most exclusive deal. My cousins especially, Preston and Cassandra, were notorious for this. They thrived on their loud success, letting their designer labels, expensive wines, and flashy talk fill the room with an air of superiority. It was an environment that left me feeling small and invisible. These dinners were held in my aunt and uncle's sprawling Napa Valley estate, a mansion that could easily house a small village. It was always pristine, always perfect, with every detail meant to showcase the Ashcraft-Oft name and legacy. But to me, it always felt hollow, more about appearances than substance. As I walked into that massive living room, the usual chatter and clinking of glasses filled the space, and I immediately knew that tonight would be no different. I took my usual seat near the fireplace, away from the center of attention, and tried my best to remain invisible. It wasn't difficult for me to blend in. I was used to being the quiet one, the one who was never quite enough for them. The Ashcraft-Oft family had always seen me as the underachiever, the one who didn't measure up. While my cousins flaunted their latest acquisitions, I remained a silent observer. But little did they know, my life wasn't as humble as they imagined it to be. Preston, the eldest of my cousins, leaned back in his chair with a glass of wine in hand, his smug smile as wide as ever. He was telling the table about his new ranch in Jackson Hole, an area in Wyoming known for its rugged beauty and extravagant properties. "Just bought a ranch in Jackson Hole," he said, his voice dripping with pride as he swirled his wineglass in the air. "Right next to the guy who owns half of Silicon Valley. Pretty cool, huh?" He threw the words out casually, as if he were announcing an everyday purchase. Cassandra, ever the show-off, wasn't going to let Preston steal all the limelight. She opened her designer clutch with a flourish, as if she were about to unveil some great treasure. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "We just closed on a vineyard in Tuscany. Private access to the Mediterranean. You can't even put a price on that kind of view." I couldn't help but suppress a smile behind my glass of iced tea. The absurdity of it all struck me. Here they were competing with each other over who had the bigger house or the more exotic getaway, while I had been quietly building something far more substantial in the background. My thoughts were interrupted by Aunt Evelyn's voice, sharp and cutting, as she turned to me. "Noah, you've been awfully quiet tonight. Not like you," she remarked, her tone dripping with condescension. Preston leaned in, a feigned expression of sympathy plastered on his face. "We were just wondering about your living situation," he said, looking me up and down as if I were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. And there it was, the question that always came up: what about my apartment in Portland? The one they all thought was a sign of my failure. "Still renting, right?" He continued, his words laced with an edge of mockery. Cassandra joined in with a fake gasp, feigning surprise. "The one on Alder Street, wasn't it? Didn't know people our age still rented." I almost laughed out loud. If only they knew. The Alder Street apartment complex was my company's first major acquisition under West Pine Holdings, a real estate firm I had founded quietly in the background. To my family, I was still a struggling tenant in a small, unimpressive duplex. In reality, I owned not just that building, but many others in the area, including a number of commercial properties. But to them, I was invisible. "I like the space," I replied, keeping my tone even. I knew better than to get into details. The more I told them, the less they'd believe me. Aunt Evelyn's voice rang out again, her smile now tinged with patronizing sweetness. "You're 35, sweetie. It's time to grow up. Buy something real." Her words were a sharp reminder of the ever-present expectations the family had for me. They saw me as someone who had failed to meet their standards. "Real? Try a $1.8 billion portfolio of multifamily buildings, commercial towers, and yes, Ashcraft Plaza, the very property you're all sitting in tonight. I thought to myself. I had acquired Ashcraft Plaza through a private equity arm that was completely off their radar. The deal had been done discreetly, and they never once suspected I was behind it. In their eyes, I was still just Noah, the one who didn't have it together. "I've managed just fine," I said, keeping my voice steady, but inside I was seething. The more they spoke, the more I realized how much I'd been underestimated. Preston, of course, wasn't finished. "You can't even afford a mortgage," he sneered, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. The jab stung, but I didn't let it show. I leaned back as well, letting them talk. Let them think what they wanted. Soon the lease renewal for Alder Street would come across their desks, and guess whose name would be on the letterhead? It was at that moment, as I quietly observed them, that I realized just how little they truly knew about me. They were so wrapped up in their own egos, their own superficial measures of success, that they never stopped to consider what I might be building in silence. And the best part? They never suspected that the poor, struggling Noah, the one they dismissed as nothing more than a renter, was the very person who owned the building they valued most. Ashcraft Plaza. Their proud family asset was now in my hands, and soon I would use it to dismantle their illusions. But for now, I would remain silent. Let them think they had won. After all, every empire is built on the foundation of quiet persistence, and mine was about to change everything. As the evening wore on, the usual chatter around the dinner table became more distant. My cousins' voices blended into a low hum, their incessant boasting about wealth status and accomplishments fading as I retreated further into my thoughts. There was something uniquely isolating about being in a room full of people who didn't even know who you were. The Ashcrafts had always been quick to judge quick, to label success based on superficial markers. Large homes, brand name vehicles, lavish vacations. If you didn't fit that mold, you were relegated to the background, your life written off as insignificant. But here I was, watching them all while knowing they could never even fathom the true scale of what I had quietly built. The Alder Street apartment wasn't the only asset I owned. It wasn't the centerpiece of my empire, just the beginning. What they didn't realize was that the Ashcraft Plaza, the very estate where they were sitting, was mine. They had been quick to dismiss me, assuming I was still stuck in a small, unremarkable life. Little did they know the game had already shifted. In the quiet corners of my mind, I calculated the next move in my strategy. I had always operated under the radar, making moves that no one saw coming. I never flaunted my assets, never engaged in the constant comparison they thrived on. Instead, I built my foundation slowly but steadily, gathering properties and equity where others overlooked. It wasn't just about owning buildings or making money, it was about control. Control over my future, control over the very spaces they inhabited. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Ashcrafts, with all their wealth and showmanship, had overlooked something far more critical than grand estates or fast cars. They had missed the power of steady, quiet growth. They were chasing after moments of fleeting glamour, while I was quietly securing the infrastructure for long-term influence. I could have easily flaunted my wealth. I could have built the grand mansion, bought the flashy cars, and hosted dinners that outshone their gatherings. But that was never the goal. What I had learned from years of watching them was that their brand of success was empty. They were obsessed with recognition, with being seen, while I was focused on creating something substantial, a legacy that didn't need anyone's validation. In some ways, my silence had been my greatest weapon. Where they boasted, I listened. Where they spent recklessly, I invested. I hadn't been interested in the short-term gains that made their egos swell. No, I had set my sights on a different horizon, one where influence and power were the true rewards, not the hollow applause of a room full of people trying to one-up each other. Over the past few years, I had made some key moves in the real estate world that few would have considered. I focused on undervalued properties, neglected neighborhoods, and revitalization projects that had been ignored by everyone else. While they spent their fortunes on luxury properties in glitzy locales, I had quietly been buying up commercial buildings in growing districts, securing real estate in emerging markets that had long-term potential. One of my most significant acquisitions had been an old factory in the outskirts of Portland, tucked between residential areas that had once been considered too risky to invest in. No one saw the value in it. Everyone was too focused on the shiny new properties in the city center, the ones that made headlines and drew in tourists. But I saw something else. The factory was a diamond in the rough, a piece of history in a rapidly changing city. It had a charm that couldn't be replicated by the sterile luxury developments my cousins were so proud of. And so I bought it. Over the next year, I transformed the factory into a mixed-use space combining retail office space and residential apartments. The neighborhood around it began to change as well. Slowly, the once neglected area started attracting businesses and young professionals who were drawn to the industrial charm of the place. It wasn't long before the area became one of the most desirable parts of Portland. While the Ashcraft-Ofts were busy acquiring properties in places that already had name recognition, I had turned an overlooked corner of the city into a thriving hub. It wasn't just the factory that I had transformed. Over the last 5 years, I had quietly accumulated other properties, small hotels, office buildings, and even an old marina that I had turned into a boutique hotel and event space. Each acquisition had been calculated. Each property had been chosen for its potential, not its immediate value. And each one was part of a larger plan to reshape Portland's real estate landscape from the inside out. By now, the Ashcraft-Oft family knew nothing about these moves. They still thought I was struggling, still thought I was simply living in a small apartment on Alder Street scraping by like everyone else. They had no idea that I was on the verge of becoming one of the city's largest real estate moguls. The beauty of it all was that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need to convince them of my worth. All I needed was time. Time to let my investments pay off, to let the neighborhood around my properties flourish, and to wait for the moment when everything would come full circle. The real test would come when I decided to unveil my plans to them, not in the form of a boast or a flashy display, but as a quiet revelation. I had no intention of throwing it in their faces, of making a grand entrance into the world of wealth and influence. That was their game, not mine. But I knew the day would come when they would realize that the quiet, invisible Noah they had all written off had in fact been playing the game all along. And when that day came, I would simply sit back, watch them squirm, and know that my success, my real success, had been built on something far more enduring than their fleeting moments of glory. The months passed, and as much as I tried to stay detached, the time was inevitably drawing near when everything would come to light. I had been operating in the shadows long enough, building my empire, piece by piece, and now the pieces were starting to fall into place. I had quietly manipulated the fabric of Portland's real estate market, moving in ways that my family would never have expected. But the moment I had been preparing for, the moment when the world would know my true worth, was fast approaching. It started small, like a ripple on a calm sea, but soon there was no denying it. My projects were beginning to dominate the local news. What had once been quiet, unremarkable properties were now being talked about in real estate circles, and the transformation of Portland's overlooked neighborhoods into thriving hubs had not gone unnoticed. My factory-turned-boutique space was buzzing with energy, attracting not just locals, but international visitors. The hotel I had built from the ground up was receiving glowing reviews, and my residential developments were in high demand. It wasn't just the media that was starting to take note, it was the people around me. the Ashcraftofts in particular. They had watched from the sidelines too, wrapped up in their own pursuits, to realize that their youngest cousin was quietly building something more substantial than any of them could imagine. But one afternoon when I bumped into my cousin Olivia at an event for one of my new commercial projects, I saw the first flicker of doubt cross her face. Olivia had always been one of the more level-headed members of the family. She had never been as flashy as the others, but even she had fallen prey to the Ashcraftoft way of measuring success. We had grown up together, and I knew that beneath her polished exterior, she always respected those who could outsmart the system. She stood next to me for a moment, staring at the building that had once been an eyesore. An old office block turned into a sleek modern complex. The kind of project my cousins had once scoffed at. "Noah," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. This is impressive." I turned to her, noticing the subtle surprise in her eyes. "I knew it would be," I replied, simply not wanting to gloat. "I've always known the value of looking past what everyone else sees." Olivia nodded, though I could tell she was still processing what I had just revealed. She glanced back at the towering building, then at me. "I never realized you were doing all of this," she said softly. "You've been so quiet about it." It was the understatement of the year. Quiet wasn't the word I would have used for the strategy I had employed. It was deliberate, silent, methodical. I had made sure that no one saw the true picture until the pieces had all fallen into place. "That's the point," I said, meeting her gaze. I didn't need to shout about it. All I needed was time. The conversation ended there, but the impact of those words lingered. Olivia wasn't the only one who had been in the dark. My entire family, from the ones who enjoyed flaunting their fortunes to the ones who just played the part of old money, had no idea that the tide had already turned. They had always thought of me as the quiet one, the one who didn't make waves, the one who simply watched. But what they failed to realize was that I wasn't watching, I was learning. I wasn't waiting, I was planning. And now, as the final pieces of my vision began to click into place, the realization began to settle in. I wasn't just some quiet relative living in the shadow of their success. I was the architect of my own future. And now they would have to reckon with the results of my silence. The tipping point came when I received a call from one of my cousins, Theo, who had always prided himself on his financial acumen. He was calling to congratulate me on my recent venture into the hospitality industry. "I'll admit, Noah," he said, with an edge of surprise in his voice, "I never thought you had it in you." I didn't respond immediately. The truth was, I hadn't needed his recognition, but hearing it from him, one of the most competitive members of our family, felt like a moment of validation. "I guess you just don't see what's coming when you're busy looking at the surface," I replied coolly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Theo calculating his next words. "I need to learn how you're doing it," he finally said, a hint of admiration in his tone. "I've been watching the market, and I have to admit, you've been making moves that none of us saw coming." I couldn't help but smile. The mask was finally slipping. The quiet moves I had made over the past few years' investments, acquisitions, strategic renovations, had finally borne fruit, and my family, who had once dismissed me as being too careful or too cautious, was now realizing that the quiet Noah had been the one playing the long game. But it wasn't just the business side of things that had shifted. It was the family dynamic itself. Where once I had been the overlooked, underestimated cousin, I was now the one with the power to dictate the conversation. I didn't need to argue my worth or force them to acknowledge my success. It was all becoming apparent in the quiet hum of success that surrounded me. The buildings I had restored, the investments I had made, the communities I had revitalized, these were my trophies. They didn't need to be flaunted. They simply needed time to speak for themselves. And in the end, that's what had truly set me apart from them. While they fought for validation in the form of flashy displays of wealth and success, I had quietly built something far more valuable, something that would last far beyond the superficiality they clung to. The day would come when the Ashcraftofts would have no choice but to acknowledge what I had done. And when that moment arrived, I would simply stand there calm and collected and let them realize that it wasn't about the flashy cars, the gold watches, or the brand-name suits. It was about vision, patience, and the ability to see beyond what everyone else was too busy to notice. With every new milestone, every new project that succeeded beyond my expectations, I found myself standing at a crossroads, caught between the satisfaction of achievement and the gnawing weight of what I had given up to get there. The success that everyone around me was starting to notice, to respect, didn't come without a cost. And the price of ambition was something I hadn't fully grasped until I started to look at the faces of the people around me. It was a strange feeling, this mix of pride and guilt, that sat heavy in my chest as I watched my family start to look at me with something closer to admiration than they ever had before. But it wasn't just admiration. There was an undercurrent of something else, jealousy perhaps, or perhaps an uncomfortable realization that my success had somehow dwarfed theirs. They had spent years building their fortunes on solid ground, secure in the knowledge that their wealth and status were never in danger. But I had built mine from nothing, with nothing but my vision, my instinct, and a steady stream of relentless determination. But as I saw their reaction, I couldn't help but feel the sting of something I hadn't expected: the isolation that came with ambition. The more successful I became, the more I found myself distanced from the people I once called my closest family. I had sacrificed so much to get where I was. Relationships that once felt warm and familiar now felt distant and strained. I had spent so much time focused on the grind, on every detail of my next big move, that I hadn't noticed how much I had pulled away from everything that used to matter to me. I wasn't just building an empire, I was losing pieces of my own life along the way. The first time I really felt the full weight of that loss was when I attended my sister Marissa's wedding. She had always been the heart of our family, the one who held everyone together with her infectious laughter, her kindness, her unwavering loyalty. And there I was, sitting in the back of the reception hall, watching her say her vows, and I realized I had missed so much. I hadn't been around as much as I should have been. I hadn't been there for her when she needed me. My success, my drive to achieve the impossible, had turned me into a stranger at my own sister's wedding. I watched her look at me, and I could see the sadness behind her smile. She was happy for me, I knew that. But there was also a quiet sorrow in her eyes, the same sorrow that I had seen in my mother's eyes the last time we spoke, a look that told me without words that she was beginning to regret the fact that she hadn't seen more of me over the years, that she had been proud of my achievements, but deeply concerned by the person I was becoming in the process. And that's when it hit me. Ambition in all its glory had come at the expense of the very things that I used to care about. Most my family, my connections, my ability to simply be present with the people I loved. I had built something incredible, yes, something I could be proud of. But what had it cost me? I had spent years chasing an image of success that I had believed was the only version worth having. The shiny buildings, the recognition from people who didn't truly know me, the endless cycle of business deals and projects. I had pushed everything else aside, convinced that once I had this, once I had achieved the pinnacle of success, it would be enough to make everything else worthwhile. But with each new success, I felt emptier, as if the more I achieved, the more I lost myself in the process. It was hard to admit that out loud to anyone, let alone to myself. For years, I had convinced myself that sacrifice was just part of the game, that in order to get ahead, I had to shed all distractions, all connections, all emotions that might pull me away from my goal. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath of yet another success, I realized that perhaps the true cost of ambition was far greater than I had ever considered. No matter how many projects I took on, no matter how many properties I renovated, or how many accolades I earned, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something intangible, something that no amount of wealth or recognition could replace. The moment of reckoning didn't come in the form of a grand revelation or some dramatic shift. It came in the simple, subtle realization that while I had gained everything I had set out to acquire, I had lost far more than I had ever imagined. My relationship with my family, my connection to the people I cared about, had eroded in ways that were far more destructive than I had ever anticipated. But there was also a part of me that knew this reckoning was necessary. It was a painful truth to confront, but it was also the beginning of understanding what success really meant. Success wasn't just about wealth, power, or influence. It was about balance. It was about recognizing when the chase for more was pulling me away from what mattered most, and finding a way to restore that balance. Looking back now, I realize that the journey I had been on wasn't just about building a business empire. It was about learning who I was in the process, about recognizing the choices I had made, and understanding the price I was willing to pay for the things I thought I wanted. I had achieved everything I had set out to achieve, and yet I couldn't help but wonder, was this the life I had envisioned for myself? The answer, I think, is still unfolding. What I do know now is that true success is never as simple as the numbers on a bank statement or the title on a business card. It's about understanding who you are, what you're willing to sacrifice, and whether the cost of your ambition is something you can live with. And more than anything, it's about learning to navigate the delicate balance between chasing your dreams and holding on to the things that make life truly worthwhile. As I stood at the crossroads of my life, I found myself grappling with a new question. What is success really? It was no longer enough to simply accumulate wealth or climb higher in the corporate world. I had achieved everything I had once thought would satisfy me, but the emptiness I felt at the core of my being told a different story. The problem was that I had built my success around external validation. The applause, the accolades, the admiration of others, these were the things I had strived for. I had become so focused on earning respect, on proving my worth, that I had forgotten to ask myself whether I was proud of the person I had become. Was I truly fulfilled? Was I living in a way that aligned with my values, or had I become a shell of who I once was? Someone whose every decision was based on external expectations rather than personal meaning. In that moment of reflection, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could continue down the same path, chasing after more accolades, more wealth, more recognition, but I knew deep down that it would only lead to further isolation. The relationships I had neglected, the time I had lost with my family, would never be regained. And so I began to wonder, could I redefine what success meant for me? The answer wasn't immediate. It wasn't a sudden revelation that made everything clear. Rather, it was a slow, painful process of self-discovery. To redefine success meant I had to go beyond the metrics that society had taught me to value. I had to start from scratch, examining what truly mattered to me beyond titles and achievements. It meant questioning my priorities, my goals, and my actions. It meant figuring out who I was outside of the business world, outside of my role as a leader, a figure of influence. One of the first steps I took in this process was to acknowledge that I had been running away from something that had been quietly nagging at me for years. That something was the absence of meaningful relationships. I had worked so tirelessly to build my professional success, but in doing so, I had lost touch with the very people who once shaped my world. I had neglected my family, my friends, and in doing so, I had isolated myself from the very connections that would have anchored me. I couldn't help but feel the weight of that isolation every time I saw a familiar face. My mother's quiet smile, Marissa's laughter, the look of concern in my father's eyes. They had been waiting for me, hoping that I would come back, hoping that I would realize that success in its truest sense was not about what you had, but who you shared it with. And so I began to make amends. I started by reaching out to Marissa. I apologized for not being there for her during the years I had been so consumed by my work. I told her that I missed her, that I was sorry I hadn't made her a priority. Her response wasn't instantaneous. She had been hurt, and it would take time for the wounds I had caused to heal. But it was a start. She accepted my apology, and we began to rebuild our connection. Next, I reached out to my mother. That conversation was the hardest of all. We had always been close, but I could tell that the years of my absence had created a distance between us that I couldn't just erase with a few words. Still, I didn't let that discourage me. I apologized for taking her for granted, for not being there when she needed me, and for letting my ambitions drive a wedge between us. It was a conversation full of tears, but it was also full of hope. Slowly, we began to reconnect, and through that process, I came to understand that real success was about rebuilding the relationships that had been there all along. But it wasn't just about mending old bonds. I also realized that I needed to grow as a person beyond my accomplishments, beyond the image I had projected to the world. I needed to reconnect with the things that had brought me joy before I became consumed with the pursuit of external success. I needed to reconnect with my passions, my hobbies, and my values. One of the first steps in this journey of personal growth was revisiting the things I loved to do, things I had once enjoyed, before they were overshadowed by deadlines and business meetings. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't for anyone else's approval. It was for me. I began to spend more time outdoors, appreciating nature in a way I hadn't in ages. I also started reading books that had once inspired me, books that I had put aside in favor of business books or financial reports. Slowly, I was rediscovering the person I used to be, the person I had neglected. But most importantly, I began to learn how to balance my professional and personal lives. I had spent so much time focusing on work that I had forgotten the importance of rest, of spending quality time with the people I loved. I learned to say no to certain business deals that didn't align with my values, and I started to prioritize moments that mattered most: family dinners, quiet weekends, and heartfelt conversations. In doing so, I also realized that the real measure of success was not in how much money I made or how many awards I collected. The true measure was in how I treated others, how I invested in my relationships, and how I lived with integrity and authenticity. Success, I realized, was not a destination, it was a journey. It was about continuous growth, not just in my career, but in my character, my relationships, and my sense of purpose. Now, as I reflect on this journey, I see that the road to true success is not an easy one. It requires vulnerability, humility, and the willingness to let go of old beliefs about what matters most. But it is also incredibly rewarding. It is about creating a life that feels aligned with who you are, one where your achievements are meaningful, not just for you, but for the people who matter most. I've learned that it's never too late to change course, to rebuild what was broken, and to redefine success on your own terms. And as I continue on this journey, I know that the most important thing is not the title I carry or the size of my bank account, but the relationships I nurture and the person I continue to grow into.